Let's look at an example. Let's suppose that we live in a very small country. In this very small country, there are only two goods, and one is milk and one is honey. So we live in the land of milk and honey. And every year we produce a certain amount of milk and a certain amount of honey. And our president of our country is, of course, always bragging about how much he's done for the economy. Well, in 2013, we produced 100 gallons of milk and 50 gallons of honey. And the milk was sold for $1 a gallon, and the honey was sold for $2 a gallon. So we have $1 times 100 and $2 times 50. That adds up to $200. If our base year was 2013, then our real GDP would also be $200. But now let's suppose that 2014 comes along, and during 2014, we produce 200 gallons of milk and 100 gallons of honey, and we sell them for the same prices. Well, our nominal GDP for that year will now be $400, because $1 times 200 gallons is 200, and 100 gallons of honey times $2 a gallon is $200. If you combine those together, you will see that our nominal GDP was $400. So the president of our country gets on our little television station and he starts bragging about how great it's been that under his leadership, the GDP has doubled in 1 year. It went from $200 to $400, and that's pretty amazing. So everybody's happy. But then 2015 comes along. And during 2015, it turns out we sell 200 gallons of milk, but not at $1 a gallon, but at $2 a gallon. And we sell 100 gallons of honey, but not at $2 a gallon, but at $4 a gallon. And so what happens is our nominal GDP is not 400, but it's $800. And so the president of the country gets on TV and he brags again. Folks, I did it again. In the second year in a row, I have doubled the GDP in our country. GDP is now $800. Last year it was 400, and the year before it was 200. Well, I'm sure you're starting to realize that he's a bit of a crook and that he's taking credit for something that isn't there. So what's the reality? The reality is we produce the same amount of milk and we produce the same amount of honey. So in fact, our GDP didn't go up at all. But something else happened. What happened was the president of the country had the federal bank print a whole bunch of extra money and put it out into the economy, causing prices to go up and double. And so what we have is a nominal GDP of 800. But what's the real GDP? Well, if we adjust it, we'll find out to real, we'll find out that it wasn't that at all. It was half that. And so it was equal to the amount that we had in 2014. So let's look at that. Well, to do that, we have to use a base year. So let's take the base year of 2013. In 2013, milk was $1 a gallon. And in 2013, honey was $2 a gallon. So let's bring those prices up to 2015. In 2015, 200 gallons of milk at $1 a gallon is $200. And 100 gallons of honey at $2 a gallon is $200. Combine them together at $400, and that $400 is the real GDP. So that is exactly the same number we had the year before. Let's make sure that 2014 is actually real. So it turns out if we bring the $1 and the $2 prices from 2013 and multiply them, they're real. And so the real GDP for 2013 was 200, for 2014 was 400, and for 2015 was 400. And so we didn't have any increase in GDP that year. Now we could just as easily have used 2015 as the base year. But in that case, what we would have to do is say, well, GDP was 800, because that's the base year, so that's the real GDP. But now we're taking prices of $2 for milk and $4 for honey. We go back to 2014 and we multiply the $2 price of milk times the 200 gallons that we produced in 2014, that gives us $400. And we take the $4 price of honey times the 100 units or 100 gallons of honey that we produce, that's another $400. So under that set of guidelines, it turns out that GDP for 2014 was 800, the same as 2015. And if we did that for 2013, we would then take the $2 price times the 100 gallons of milk, which is 200, and then we would multiply the $4 price of honey times the 50 units, which is $200, or in other words, 400. And so you can see the relationship between each of these years is the same no matter what base year that we're using. The ratios are the same. And so the key thing here is we're going to use the prices from the base year. We have to have a base year. We're going to use the prices from the base year and multiply them times the quantities of the other years. Once we have the real GDP, then we can take the nominal GDP of that year divided by the real GDP, and we will have a GDP deflator. And that deflator can then be used to calculate a number of things, including the amount of inflation in one year. So let's try that with the 2014-2015 years in our little country. So what we have is we have a nominal GDP in 2015 of 800 and a real GDP of 400. And so that would be a real GDP deflator of 200. And so then we look at 2014 and we see that the real GDP was 400 and the nominal GDP was 400 and the real GDP was 400. We divide that and the GDP deflator is 100. And if we do the same thing for 2013, we'll see that again, the GDP deflator is 100. So we now have our GDP deflators. So how much inflation was there between 2013 and 2015? Well, to calculate that, we have to take the GDP deflator for 2015, which is 200, and we have to subtract the GDP deflator from 2013, which is 100, leaving 100 left. We then divide that by the GDP deflator, which is 100, and what do we get? We get a 100% increase in inflation, and that's what we had. So there's a very important thing happening here that you need to be careful of, and that is there is a base year, but when you're calculating the inflation rate between years, you don't use a base year, you use just the GDP deflator. And so you're going to find the difference between the GDP deflators between those 2 years. And then you're going to divide that number by the first year of your two numbers, not the base year's number. And so it just so happened that the example I gave you was the base year, but in other cases it most likely wouldn't be. And that would give you the inflation rate between those 2 years. So again, the formula for calculating the inflation rate using the GDP deflator is to take GDP deflator 2 minus GDP deflator 1, and then that number divided by GDP deflator 1.